once I started realizing that the nonprofit sector was blocking even access to those solutions that they were coming up with, and was suppressing our ability to replicate those and scale those in other states. And basically, we've got an information suppression blockade going on, where the nonprofits are basically protecting the status quo in order to basically maintain their own relevancy. But while I was away from the nonprofit sector and trying to, maybe wants to have this conversation, who else is potentially positioned to be able to make these differences and create these changes in the community that's not controlled by the NGO, basically industrial complex? And I started getting really deep into the farmer world. So about a year and a half ago, I pivoted over to the farming community, and I started talking to farmers. I started talking to farmer advocates, and I found out that sector it's very independent. That a lot of the people in that world, they're just trying to get by. They're not tied into the drama in the urban nonprofit world. It doesn't really touch them, and the dynamics are very different.
Welcome to Now Boarding, all my listeners and viewers, the show where we dive into the journey of people who are redefining what's possible across industries, identities, and also impact. My guest today is a systems thinker, a disabled veteran, a former nightclub owner, and now he's an innovator tackling some of our biggest challenges in climate and food resilience. Thank you so much for joining me today, Shannon Dobbs.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for inviting me, Pale.
Great. So, Shannon, you've had quite a journey from army logistics to nightclub owner to systems designer for climate resilience. I'd love for you to walk us through that transformation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I got out of the Army. I was active duty in the 90s. And I joined in 92, the same year that the Los Angeles riots were happening, out of LA. And so even before I got to basic training, I had this really transformational experience of seeing Los Angeles on fire, watching the National Guard get called out to protect the last market that hadn't been burned down in probably a 5-mile radius. So millions of people were at risk of food insecurity because of what was going on in the community and in society. And me and my friends were literally raiding the dining facility on campus. I was at USC campus in South Central, and we were raiding the dining facility to grab donuts and coffee and stuff and run them across the street to the National Guard troops so we could find out what's going on. And we were tapping them for information and everything like that. And I was on my way to basic training. I actually had to ship out of San Diego because the Los Angeles MEP station and the recruiting station that I got recruited out of got burned to the ground. And I almost didn't get in. I almost had to restart the entire process again, which would have been crazy. But yeah, I shipped off to basic training with that fresh in my mind. And then I got into a job called psychological operations, where my job was essentially troubleshooting systemic challenges and working to create coalitions across different stakeholder identities to be able to solve intractable issues that regular Army units weren't able to deal with because of the structure of how the military is set up. So I was in a special operations unit that was focused essentially on nation building, on hearts and minds campaigns, on strategic development of how do we put the system back together when it's messed up on the inside. But my secret passion was always running nightclubs. And so on the weekends, I'd be sitting with my friends and just penciling out ideas of nightclubs on napkins at clubs in Fayetteville in North Carolina where I was stationed. And so when I got out in 98, I beelined it over to Las Vegas. I started jumping into the nightclub industry. And that's basically where I've been for pretty much ever since. I moved up to Reno in 2005 and took over an LGBT bar that was an iconic location in the state of Nevada. Ended up running that for 11 years and turned it into the #1 dance club in Northern Nevada. Bought a second location. I ended up purchasing a huge former casino property that had gone out of business. There was a nightclub on the second floor that I wanted. And so I ended up using SBA's loan system, the Small Business Association, to be able to get the property, reopen the nightclub. And I ended up running that as a second location. And then in 2015, I saw an article where the mayor was quoted as asking, why can't we get a grocery store in downtown Reno? And that was the first I knew that we had a situation that our leadership didn't really know what to do about. I'd heard about food deserts, but I thought that everybody was doing everything they could. And this was an opening situation for me where I was like, oh, wait, the leadership doesn't have a clue what to do. I've got 17,000 square feet of ground floor commercial retail in the heart of downtown Reno, about 2 blocks away from the bus hub. Why don't I just donate that space that I'm not using, because I'm operating the nightclub on the second floor at the time, and I'll just donate the space and we'll just get a grocery store in. Problem solved. That sent me down a huge rabbit hole because I found out that it wasn't that simple. The mayor of the city wasn't actually trying to get support for local initiatives going. They were trying to troll for a Trader Joe's. The nonprofit sector saw a competitive threat in getting grocery access, and they didn't want their pantries to know that they could actually run businesses next to the pantries that they were running. Other businesses were infiltrating the Food Policy Council, and lobbyists basically had control of our mechanisms for food access. And I started seeing different mechanisms involved in the back end that was essentially suppressing efforts to try and get better food access in the community because they were maintaining artificial scarcity of food. And so once I started seeing those things start popping up, that's when I started really understanding that this situation is a lot different from the way it's being perceived by the public. And I just kept going down a rabbit hole, kept advocating. A lot of this ended up being self-advocacy because of my disabilities. I've struggled in the kitchen. I've struggled with food security, even though I've got funds coming in to be able to pay for food. Actually preparing it and cleaning the dishes and doing those things physically is really demanding for me. And I had a head injury in the Army from a parachuting accident. And so sometimes following steps in the kitchen is a challenge for me. Sometimes I'll walk away and start a fire in my kitchen. Because of those reasons, I experience food insecurity personally. And so a lot of the direction that I'm coming from is from that perspective of people that have barriers that the public doesn't necessarily see.
Okay. So how, I mean, you've talked about humi soil. What is humi soil? How does it work? And what makes it such a breakthrough in regenerative agriculture?
Okay, in order to answer that question, we have to take a few steps back in kind of the story and narrative of how I got from here to there, or from there to here. Like I said, I was first and initially focused just on the grocery store model and how do we deal with food deserts. But when I got so much pushback from in the system that it became apparent that we weren't going to be allowed to get a grocery store in place, we weren't going to be allowed to put food access into these communities because it was being considered a competitive threat by, major institutions in the nonprofit sector. I ended up going to food rescue as a way to develop initiatives that could get food access in the communities that didn't create that direct competition threat. And so I became aware there was a program going on in Las Vegas at the time where the MGM Grand Resorts was collaborating with the food bank, and they figured out how to use a transformational piece of equipment called a blast chiller to be able to safely rescue prepared meals from restaurants and hotels and hospitals and schools and ballparks and you name it, all the places where food is made. And this is a category of food that we've never been able to get our hands on before because of the difficulty of transitioning the food from hot hold, ready to serve, back down to refrigerated. If you put that into a freezer, it's going to take 10 or 12 hours to get down to refrigerated, and it'll make everything else in the freezer unsafe as well. And so we've had this logistics challenge, and the MGM cracked that code back in 2016 and figured out how we can get that food safely in by using a piece of manufacturing equipment that it only, if you go into the supermarkets and you get on the frozen food aisle, everything there was frozen with blast chillers. So this is not new tech, but it had never been put on the other end of the food system. Once I started realizing that the nonprofit sector was blocking even access to those solutions that they were coming up with and was suppressing our ability to replicate those and scale those in other states. And basically we've got an information suppression blockade going on where the nonprofits are basically protecting the status quo in order to basically maintain their own relevancy. But while I was away from the nonprofit sector and trying to, maybe wants to have this conversation, who else is potentially positioned to be able to make these differences and create these changes in the community that's not controlled by the NGO, basically industrial complex? And I started getting really deep into the farmer world. So about a year and a half ago, I pivoted over to the farming community and I started talking to farmers. I started talking to farmer advocates, and I found out that sector it's very independent. That a lot of the people in that world, they're just trying to get by. They're not tied into the drama in the urban nonprofit world. It doesn't really touch them. And the dynamics are very different. And also farmers have the ability to understand the scale and the scope of what's necessary in order to meet the level of need that we're dealing with. So I started pivoting in that direction, and I started putting together this system that incorporated the retail stores and the blast chillers as essentially a one-stop shop fully circular system that would allow us to be able to use our resources at the back end of urban systems in a more efficient way. And what I was looking for was the final piece of what do you do if you can't catch the food before it hits the ground? We've got composting, but composting is very problematic. You lose 70% of the biomass to methane and CO2 emissions. You've got fire risk, you've got pest risk, it's got stench that you can't use it close to human habitation. You got the NIMBY situation going on. And so it's a problematic situation. And besides compost, the only thing we really have that we can do with waste is agricultural waste and food waste is either bury it or burn it. And that's a problem because all of those processes contribute to climate change. All of those processes move the needle a little bit, but they also create their own problems. And so I came across this absolutely groundbreaking technology out of Australia called Humisoil that was developed by a company called VRM Biologic. And this is about a decade ago. This is a proven model. It's been operating in 33 countries and counting. It's been presented at COP28 in 2023. So this is not a new product. The problem is here in the United States, that product is basically being rejected by the compost industry because it's a competitive threat to their other products. And so we have a market mismatch situation where Humisoil, which has the ability to transform any bio waste, so agricultural waste, food waste, even fire mitigation waste. So if you chop down trees because of beetle kill or because you're trying to clear the forest, you remember that stupid quote about we need to rake the forest? The reality is we do need to clear some of this deadwood out because but the question is, what do you do with it? And again, you've got the process of either 2 years of composting where you lose 70% of the material, you either bury it or you burn it. And again, all of these are problematic. Now along comes this product that can transform all of that into high-grade topsoil that uses bacterial photosynthesis to literally grow water from air.
Yeah, I was going to ask you because you have mentioned and described humus soil as literally growing water. I wanted to understand from you how that actually works in the real world and what kind of benefits do the communities have as a result of that. So you've answered a bit of it, but I don't know if there's anything else that you'd like to add to that.
There's a lot. I'll defer to the experts. There are case studies out there. I can share a link to the COP28 presentation that was developed by a Malaysian practitioner that was developing it out in Southeast Asia. But the essence is, if you know how photosynthesis works in plants, basically it uses the energy of the sun to be able to transform chemicals into different chemicals. So it creates molecules, whether that's sugars, whether that's whatever it is that the plant needs to grow. That photosynthesis process is the energy engine, essentially, that allows all of those things to happen. Even before plants existed on the planet, bacteria was also using photosynthesis. And this is something that a lot of people don't really know about. But yeah, bacterial photosynthesis is absolutely a thing. And what this company did was it found a particular bacteria that likes biowaste. It eats matter and turns it into a byproduct, which is really good topsoil. And the photosynthesis process that this bacteria does actually creates water molecules.
Oh, okay.
Which is, it's almost science fiction what this stuff is able to do. So the particular process that this company developed and patented, and they're basically distributing it around the planet as saying, hey, if you've got a use for this, go ahead and get it and start growing your own and create your own bacteria, create your own piles, start generating the topsoil, and essentially create that connection. So it's being used in fire mitigation in Germany. It's being used to grow crops all over the world. And what they're finding out is that when you apply this to degraded soil, it actually helps to regenerate that soil. So it helps to bring it back to full capacity, to make nutrients more bioavailable. It reduces irrigation needs by 30 to 50% or more. They've actually put this stuff directly on sand in the UAE, like sand, not dirt, and had multiple seasons of perennial wheat grown without any irrigation at all. Wow. And no rainfall. And so if you think about that, like the scope of what that makes possible here in the Southwest US, certain areas in Europe, most of Africa, you've got a whole lot of areas where something like that has a huge amount of potential, because not only do you have the drought resistance effect of having reduced rainfall or reduced irrigation needs, you also have the fire mitigation effect on two sides. If the soil is holding water, then that makes it a lot harder to burn anything that's in that area. And on top of that, you have a mechanism where you can clear the dead wood out of the area. And so the stuff that's fire prone, that's dry, that's kindling and ready to ignite, you actually have a mechanism where we can turn that into topsoil. We can also turn things like brewery spent grains, grape process, like basically anything coming out of wineries, anything coming out of food manufacturing, animal waste, animal carcasses. Think about the scope of what that opens the door to. And what's really exciting for me is it actually creates an opportunity to bridge the production and consumption model in the urban world back to the land. And it gives us an opportunity to actually move these products that's being considered waste in the cities back out to the farm as useful topsoil. And the composition and transference process is so rapid and it's so easy to deploy that it can literally be done anywhere in the world, and is being done everywhere in the world, pretty much except the US.
Oh, really? It's not being done in the US as yet?
So what's happening, like here in Colorado, there's a composting company up in the northern part of the state that was actually carrying this product, and they stopped carrying it 3 years ago because they couldn't find a market fit. And so the challenge isn't that it's not allowed here, it's that the existing industries that are so used to like following along with compost ideas, they see this process as so completely alien to what they've invested millions of dollars in some cases into, that their sunk cost fallacy is basically forcing them to step away from the product because of the fact that it's competing with their other brands and their other models. And so that's a weird kind of unique challenge here in the US, is that our market controls and dictates whether we get to respond to climate change.
And so what is your involvement? Are you trying to bring about that change? Are you working towards? Because I think it's also, like you mentioned, it helps farmland, right? It's like actually urban waste being turned into agricultural gold in a sense.
Yeah.
So how can you help or work towards at least creating some kind of impact and awareness within, if not all of the US, but at least within these around where you live? Is there any effort being made, whether it's you or it's any?
The interesting challenge that I'm in is multiple. I'm still disabled. And so I'm not going to run out there and start a tractor up and do this stuff myself. I'm not going to be the person creating piles. I have to stay in an advocacy role. And really, my role is connecting these dots and creating these opportunities where the farming community can get a better understanding of, yeah, we can actually get our hands on these abilities if we come at it collectively. If we come at it as a farmers union or as a cooperative or as a collective or as a coalition or whatever you want to call it, we can actually get the distributorship for this product, bring it into the area, get the equipment, and now the entire region has access to this. So that's the direction that we're advocating. What I'm also doing is I'm not staying in my region. So because of all the challenges that we've had with the NGO sector, and because there's been such stiff resistance behind the scenes, and this is not legal actions, by the way, they're not, a lot of times it's individual agents inside nonprofit organizations that are acting without the blessing or even the knowledge of the leadership of their own organizations. These are agents that are working essentially as unpaid and unrecognized lobbyists inside the system, and that are working within that system to leverage the trusted network in order to basically get nonprofits to stop talking to me and other advocates that are working towards transformational change. So that's how that's working. It's not like the organizations themselves are saying, screw you, you can't work in our turf. It's actually individuals working behind the scenes in those organizations that are creating these blockages. And I've seen this in multiple states now. So this is something that's a problem here in the US. So what I'm doing is I'm essentially reaching out beyond our borders to advocates in Canada and in Europe and in South America and over in Africa. And we're starting to have a conversation at the global level, not only about the fact that we can harness these technologies and these strategies, but also about the reasons why we can't do this in certain areas and what forces are really happening to block these things from gaining traction and gaining support with the public. The situations like I've got at least 2 nonprofit organizations that I found out are being threatened to have their resources pulled if they associate with us. So that's the type of pressure that's being pulled. It's very manipulative, very much your back end messing around.
Yeah, which
So
is
it is a challenge. And the very real possibility is that we won't be allowed to do this here in our area. There's a lot of pressure to stop this stuff. But I'm talking to folks in the Caribbean right now that see huge value in being able to do this in an island area. If we can harness this down there and show this is how it can work in the islands, this is how we can tie this in with the tourism industry and create circularity. This is how we can have conversations with corporations about how to benefit their bottom line by incorporating circular dynamics like the MGM Grand did. You know, the fact that we've got case studies where this is being done at scale. Last May, the MGM Grand celebrated their 5 millionth meal rescued.
wow.
And that's with 2 years off for COVID out of only 20 donor properties. So imagine how rapidly that could scale if we understand what these technologies can truly do. And really keeping having these conversations like we're having today is how we do that. That's how we have the ability to reach out past the sensors and start having a discussion about what's really possible.
Absolutely. And I think it all kind of ties in with sustainable practices, with being able to help communities when it comes to the farmland in a certain way, and also prevent food waste. There's so many different benefits that can actually come through because of something, if it's been able to, if it's allowed to be able to scale up. I think it's phenomenal. Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine the possibilities if you've got, so it goes beyond farming. So imagine if you've got a technology and a strategy that allows the Coors distributorship and manufacturing down in Golden, Colorado, to be able to take all their spent grain and transfer it into a drought-resistant topsoil that can then go onto the crops for the next year's grain. Now they're reducing their inputs, they're benefiting their bottom line, they're creating circularity that they can market out to their entire all of the people that buy that particular brand. We're having a conversation with folks in the global level of Budweiser right now. The sustainability lead is out in South Africa, and we're trying to have a conversation about how we can incorporate that at the corporate level. The problem is that the sustainability lead is tied in with local farmers and basically has backyard deals with them and doesn't want to switch over to something that even benefits their own company. So a lot of this is about how do we put pressure on corporations and how do we put pressure on the legislators and the advocacy groups and even like regenerative practitioners. Is there's an entire sector of regenerative practitioners that know how to regenerate degraded land, and they know how to go through the process of doing agroforestry and silvopasturage, and how do we regenerate the damage that we've done collectively across the planet. The problem is they're struggling with how to scale their practice to be able to meet the need. And incorporating technologies like Humasoil can actually help that sector with onboarding, with aligning with farming communities, with aligning with waste mitigation, with fire mitigation, with all of these different sectors. And this becomes a string that allows everybody to be working on the same playing field. And I think that's probably the biggest, most important factor of this from an advocacy realm, is that if we understand that we don't have to operate in silos. We can actually work together across at a higher level across these walls that we've created for ourselves and start looking at the same solutions from these different lenses. And so, okay, I may be a firefighter and I may not necessarily care about climate change, but I care about my job. I care about reducing fire risk. Maybe I'm a contractor working to rebuild the LA basin after a fire. And we're starting to think, oh, maybe we need to restore the wetlands. And maybe we need to design this in a different way so that we don't run into the same problems over and over again. These technologies are a powerful tool in our toolkit to be able to do that.
And how expensive is it?
It's actually not bad. The commercial kitchen requirements for the blast chillers it takes a lot of money to make a commercial kitchen. But here's the thing, a lot of organizations in every community on earth have a commercial kitchen already. Think about your neighborhood church. Think about the Kiwanis, the Boys and Girls Club, the Masonic Temple down the street, the schools that only operate during bank hours. You've got all of these organizations have gone through the expense of building commercial kitchens, and all we have to do is add one piece of equipment to that existing kitchen to turn it into a last mile food rescue location. That's transformative.
Yeah.
That opens the door so that small grassroots group don't have to wait for me to come around and say, hey, here's how I'm going to do this for you. All they have to do is crowdfund the equipment. All we have to do is show them where the equipment is, how to put it in place, how to create the system. And that's essentially what I've been doing. I created a masterclass that literally walks you step by step through the process of putting this in place in your community. And you don't need me. You don't need me, which is great. Same thing with human soil. There's piles popping up all over. I talked to a guy in Hudson Valley, New York, that just built his first pile with humus soil. The main distributor ships out of Florida. It's not operating here in Colorado or down in New Mexico, but there's different pockets where it's starting to come together. The problem is we're all approaching this piecemeal as individual projects. And what we need to be doing is bringing a coalition together so that we can collectively get this distributing license and start deploying it strategically around the country and around the world. That's what I'm working towards.
Yeah. Looks like a very tall ask, but I think if you've really put your mind to it, and you're absolutely right, I think collectively, if people put their heads together and have one single goal, which is what you're talking about, I think it's possible to do. I hope people who are listening in or watching this conversation will take away from it, and let's hope that it makes a difference, because I think even if it's one step at a time.
You've already got people that are advocating at the policy level. You've got people that are advocating yelling at corporations saying, stop doing that to anybody who's doing bad stuff. We've already got those systems in place. We have a long history of protest and policy battles and all of this stuff that we're doing up at this level. What I'm trying to do is introduce another layer at this level. These are things that we can do within existing policy. We don't have to ask for permission. We don't have to change any laws. All of the systems are in place. This is low-hanging fruit. This is literally the opportunities that we as communities can come together and create without having to ask. There's no mommy and daddy in charge telling us what we can and can't do. This is our system. This is our community. This is our market.
Yeah.
We're just so used to waiting for somebody else's permission that we just don't do it.
Yeah, I know. And that's what holds you back. Yeah. So if you could leave the audience with just one core message, what would that be?
So the core message is that we don't have to wait for permission. There's tools that every single community has access to. I talk about this a lot on my website at livingsys.org, livingsys.org. I write articles. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. I've got 3 books written. There's a lot of people that are out having discussions about how do we change the system. But a lot of the narrative is really focused on this macro, oh my God, the system is huge. The system is, you can't get an angle on it. And if you drill down to lower levels and start looking at what can I do in my neighborhood, in my community, even in my own backyard, you look at the scales, we talk about bioregional scale, we talk about municipal scales, but what about like just raising chickens? Now you've got a way to feed all of your food scraps and you don't have to throw it away. So that itself is a level of circularity that we need to discuss. And especially right now, with the wheels falling off of the global supply chain, we need to really start rethinking how we get access to our food resources, how we deal with stewardship of our scarce resources, how we deal with our water. We really need to start thinking about efficiency, tightening up our system, because especially here in the United States, we have a history of assuming that we have unlimited resources. And that assumption is a big part of the reason why 40% of everything that we create in this country ends up in landfills. So if we can start really rethinking that we don't have to grow more food, we just have to use the food that we have better and get it back into our communities and stop thinking of it as waste and start thinking of it as misplaced resources that we can put systems in place in order to be able to put it where it's supposed to be. That's going to change everything.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Shannon. This was very informative even for me, and I really appreciate all the effort that has been made. And I think at the end of sometimes these things, these challenges that you face eventually lead up to something concrete and results. So I'm hoping for that to happen sooner than later. And
it's already happening.
Oh, excellent. And I'm happy that you were able to share all of this on my show Now Boarding, because if this can also help reach out to more people, a conversation like this, it would be great. So thank you so much once again.
My pleasure. Can I leave you with one more thought?
Yes, absolutely.
I think this is so important, is that a lot of people like me that have disabilities assume that we can't do things, that we're not part of this conversation. There is a lot that we can do. We can reach out, we can advocate, we can make phone calls, we can connect people, we can show up at city council meetings, we can share our voice. There's a lot that people with disabilities can do. And the thing is, we have a narrative in our country where everybody's independent, everybody's taking care of themselves. And we don't have enough conversations about interdependence and the need for creating structures that allow us to take care of each other. So right now, a big thing that we need to really start thinking about moving into climate uncertainty and all the things that are coming down the pipe is mutual aid and what that looks like when we scale it up to the systemic level.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, and I appreciate you sharing that as well. Thank you so much once again, Shannon. Great talking to you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
You have a fabulous day ahead.